The summer of the year 1683 brought with it a heat that seemed to radiate from the very gates of hell. Across the dusty plains of Hungary, a force of unprecedented magnitude was moving slowly but inexorably toward the heart of Europe. It was a leviathan of war, composed of soldiers and engineers and servants that stretched for miles across the horizon. This was the army of the Ottoman Empire, led by the ambitious Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. His target was the city of Vienna, known to the Turks as the Golden Apple. To capture this fortress city would be to unlock the gateway to Western Europe and fulfill a century of imperial ambition. The sheer scale of the invading force paralyzed the courts of Europe with terror. Historical estimates suggest that up to 300,000 men marched under the green banners of the Prophet. Against this tidal wave, the defenses of Vienna seemed pitifully inadequate. Emperor Leopold I made the calculated but cowardly decision to flee the city with his court, leaving the citizens to their fate. The defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man of iron will, who commanded a garrison of only 11,000 soldiers and 5,000 citizen militia. The mathematical disparity was grotesque. For every one defender on the walls, there were nearly 20 invaders sharpening their blades in the valley below. On the 14th of July, the Ottoman army completed its encirclement of the city. A tent city arose around Vienna that was larger and more opulent than the capital it besieged. This was not merely a military camp, but a mobile metropolis, complete with bathhouses and fountains and execution grounds. Inside the stone walls of Vienna, the reality was starkly different. The city was sealed off from the world, and the clock began to tick toward starvation. Kara Mustafa did not intend to storm the walls immediately, as he wished to capture the city intact, to plunder its riches for himself. Instead, he unleashed a war of engineering. Ottomans were the masters of siege warfare, and they brought with them 5,000 specialized miners. The battle for Vienna would not be fought solely on the ramparts, but deep underground in the dark and suffocating earth. The Ottoman sappers dug complex networks of tunnels toward the city's foundations, intending to pack them with gunpowder and blow the walls into dust. The Viennese defenders responded by digging their own counter-tunnels. Men fought and died in cramped darkness, armed with pickaxes and shovels, stabbing at enemies they could barely see by the light of flickering torches. It was a claustrophobic nightmare where the collapse of a tunnel meant a slow death by suffocation. Above ground, the Ottoman artillery pounded the fortifications day and night, denying the defenders sleep. As August dragged on, the situation inside the city deteriorated from critical to hopeless. The heat intensified the stench of unburied bodies, and disease began to ravage the garrison. Dysentery, which the soldiers called the bloody flux, killed more men than the Ottoman muskets. Cats and rats disappeared from the streets, having been hunted for food by a starving populace. Yet Starhemberg refused to surrender. He knew that the fall of Vienna would likely mean the enslavement or massacre of its inhabitants. By early September, the walls were failing. The massive bastions that protected the city had been undermined and shattered by repeated explosions. The Ottomans had breached the outer defenses and were fighting hand-to-hand with the Austrians in the rubble. Starhemberg sent desperate messengers slipping through the enemy lines with a simple plea: no more time to lose. The city had perhaps 3 days of life left before the final assault would overrun them. Kara Mustafa prepared his troops for the final blow, confident that victory was inevitable. But while the Ottomans focused their gaze on the dying city, a storm was gathering to the north. King John Sobieski of Poland had mobilized his army and marched south to honor a defensive treaty with the Holy Roman Empire. It was a march of incredible speed and logistical brilliance. He united his forces with the German and Austrian armies, forming a relief force of nearly 80,000 men. Among them was the elite heavy cavalry of Poland, known as the Winged Hussars. On the 11th of September, the Ottoman sentries looked up to the peaks of the Vienna woods and saw the impossible. Signal fires burned on the Kahlenberg mountain, announcing that help had arrived. Kara Mustafa had committed a fatal strategic error by failing to fortify the high ground behind his siege lines. He had arrogantly believed that no Christian army would dare to challenge his supremacy. The morning of the 12th of September dawned with a thick fog covering the battlefield. The relief army began its descent from the hills, slowly pushing back the Ottoman perimeter. It was a day of grinding infantry combat as the coalition forces fought to clear the vineyards and ravines. Kara Mustafa was forced to split his attention. Between the new threat on the hills and the city he was so close to conquering, he refused to lift the siege, keeping his best janissaries in the trenches while sending tired irregulars to hold back the Polish king. It was a gamble born of hubris. By the late afternoon, the coalition infantry had secured a dominant position on the plains below the hills. The Ottoman lines were wavering, but they were not broken. King Sobieski, watching from the high ground, saw that the moment had come to deliver the killing blow. He ordered the charge. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the ground began to tremble. Emerging from the forest came the vanguard of the winged hussars. 18,000 horsemen began to accelerate down the slopes of the Kahlenberg. Remains to this day the largest cavalry charge in the history of warfare. The visual impact was designed to terrify. The hussars wore wooden frames on their backs adorned with eagle feathers, which created a terrifying humming noise as the wind rushed through them. Their armor shone in the late afternoon sun, and their lances were tipped with long pennants. Looked as if a landslide of steel was cascading down the mountain. The momentum of the charge was unstoppable. The heavy cavalry smashed into the Ottoman lines with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering their formations instantly. The psychological effect was devastating. The Ottoman soldiers, exhausted from months of siege and demoralized by the sudden appearance of this fresh army, broke and ran. The panic spread like a contagion through the ranks. Even the Grand Vizier tried to rally his personal guard, but the flood of Polish steel was overwhelming. Within an hour, the battle was effectively over. The invincible army of the Ottoman Empire dissolved into a chaotic mob, fleeing toward the Hungarian border. They left behind their artillery, their supplies, and the immense tent city that had housed them for months. King John Sobieski entered the Grand Vizier's tent, which was a complex of silk and gold larger than many European palaces. He famously paraphrased Julius Caesar writing to the Pope, "I came, I saw, and God conquered." Inside the abandoned camp, the looting began. The soldiers found unimaginable treasures, including diamonds and gold and strange sacks of dark beans that the Austrians initially thought were camel feed. A soldier named Jerzy Kolchitsky recognized them as coffee beans, leading to the legendary founding of Vienna's first coffee house. But the cultural impact paled in comparison to the geopolitical earthquake that had just occurred. The victory at Vienna was the turning point in a struggle that had lasted for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, which had been the dominant power in the Mediterranean and the Balkans, ceased to be a threat to Central Europe. They would never again besiege a major European capital. From this day forward, the Ottomans would be on the defensive, slowly receding over the coming centuries until their final collapse. For Vienna, the relief was a miracle. The bells of the city, which had been silent or tolling for the dead, rang out in a cacophony of triumph. Count Starhemberg, the man who had held the line against impossible odds, met King Sobieski in the ruins of the suburbs. The devastation was absolute, but the city stood. The defense of Vienna was not merely a military victory. It was the salvation of a civilization. Had the city fallen, the road to Rome and Paris would have been open. The history of the world would have been written in a different script. Because of the endurance of a few thousand starving defenders and the thunder of Polish hooves, the tide was turned. Kara Mustafa paid the ultimate price for his failure. Upon returning to Belgrade, he was executed on the orders of the Sultan, strangled with a silk cord. His ambition had led 300,000 men to disaster and broke the back of Ottoman expansionism forever. Today, the Kahlenberg remains a quiet hill overlooking the modern city of Vienna. It is hard to imagine that on those slopes the fate of a continent was decided in a single afternoon. The echoes of that charge have faded, but the line drawn in the sand on that September day remains indelible. It serves as a brutal reminder that history often hinges on the resolve of a few men standing in the breach. The year 1683 marked the end of an era and the beginning of the rise of the European powers. It was the day the sun set on the Ottoman dream of a universal empire.